Welcome everyone popping in. We will get started in a minute or a minute and a half, knowing that some people are late to the Zoom room. If I were to make a joke, I don't know how you could be late to Zoom, but I say that having been late to Zoom. Okay. And because I am sharing the screen, I don't get to see everyone, but it is nice to see all of you who I can see. And I want to thank all of you for returning tonight. We are going to be continuing on our journey on how the Crusades inform the present. Last week, we went through some of the ideas of sacred land that come out of the Crusades and how those understandings of land could connect in some ways to violence. And so today, in our third session, we're going to be talking about an idea called sacred violence. And so we will be following the theme of sacred violence throughout the session tonight as a way of trying to define it, to understand it, to grapple with it. And so with that, I have a caveat. There will be 3 breakout rooms tonight. And the questions that you will be answering in your breakout rooms are designed to inspire conversation between all of you. These are very sensitive matters. These are matters that all of us think deeply about and have a relationship to. Some of us have experience with, not just the theoretical aspects and historical aspects of violence, but actual experience with physical and mental violence. And so we want to be cognizant of those experiences in these spaces tonight. And so the questions that you'll be answering are not questions that you're required to, in the sense that you will be getting a quiz at the end of the course, but rather it's there to generate conversation. So if a question doesn't fully appeal to you or you don't connect to it, you have several options. It's a way to get everyone in the room involved. And so tonight I want to start with this slide on sacred violence. You'll notice Caravaggio's famous painting, the Sacrifice of Isaac, which denotes a great deal of violence simply because of the look on Isaac's face. And the reason why I wanted to share this particular image is almost counterintuitive, because I'm not going to be talking about the violence in the image, but rather how we use images of art and culture in general as a way of actually dehumanizing others to create conditions of violence. Think about the categories we use to engage aesthetically, whether it's through film, poetry, art. We actually use moral terminology. We will say that is good or bad art. Right? So we're going to create moral distinctions on something aesthetic as a way of saying that whatever it is that my culture produces has an inherent good. And sometimes what you produce is bad. And so you might think that that's hyperbolic, but very often you'll hear people attribute moral qualities to the aesthetics that people choose. So if I say country music or rap music, romantic comedy or sci-fi, and then I give you some examples, there are ways in which we can start to dehumanize those who connect with those particular pieces of art. Whether or not that's part of our nature is not what I'm interested in tonight, but rather how culture plays a role in determining our proclivity towards dehumanizing and violence. Hence the quote at the bottom of your screen. There is no document of culture which is not at the same time a document of barbarism. And just quickly, the word barbarism, from barbarian, is the Greek word to describe those who don't have access to speech. They're illiterate. The Greeks used this as a way of demonizing the Germanic tribes of the north by saying this is how they communicate to one another. They say bar, 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 that they don't even have a grammar. That sort of puts them at a lesser form of being human. So tonight, we have our welcome and welcome. We'll have our first breakout room in 5 minutes. And then we'll talk about the violence of 1096. It's what we call the Rhineland massacres. So not violence in what we learned last week is called the Holy Land by a few, but rather the violence that takes place in Europe. We'll go to the second breakout room 15 minutes after. And then I want to look at some contemporary justifications for sacred violence. Contemporary meaning democratic, liberal forms of justifying of sacred violence. And so I want to get us to a place where we understand what's at stake when we do that. And then Matt, Halla, and I will take 5 minutes each to try to understand how our religious traditions grapple with the realities of sacred violence. It's assumed that most of you probably don't advocate for violence and that your religious traditions informs forms of peace in most of your lives, but we have to recognize the realities of violence that's done in our own name. And then there will be a third breakout room and some parting thoughts. So what is the origin of sacred violence? So since we only have 4 minutes, I'm not going to tell you, but that was planned. What I have here is the phrase, "in the beginning was the word." And for those New Testament scholars in the room, you know that that comes from the book of John. There is a biblical understanding that also goes back to the Hebrew Bible that the word in Hebrew is davar, which can also mean thing or deed. That word, thing, and deed are actually the same word simultaneously. So that when you say something, it's an act, it's a deed. So if there is violence inherent in the words that you use, there will be violence in the world. And the book of Psalms justifies this by saying that life and death are in the power of the tongue, that speaking is a form of creating and doing. And interestingly, and this will be your one footnote for the night that you probably didn't know, a medieval mystical commentary on the Hebrew Bible called the Zohar coins the phrase abracadabra. I think you've all heard abracadabra. Well, tonight you'll learn what that means. It means I create as I speak, that there's a power with the words. So if we're going to understand the origins of violence, we're going to have to understand it with the origin of the word. But as Goethe tells us, in the beginning was the deed in his Faust, that in fact it's the deed that inspires violence, and that it's only the word that justifies it or tries to explain it away. So in the Bible, you all know who Cain was, the murderer of Abel, the man who invented murder, is also the person who invented cities, invented culture, according to the Bible. That this idea that the person could invent both is a way of cautioning us against the idea that technological progress is the same as moral progress, and that was intentional. That sometimes when we think about our culture, we think in terms of technology, and that we conflate that with morality, that somehow having access to better things makes us better people. And then finally, in the beginning is the relation. And that's Martin Buber, and that's from his Ein Dao. The idea that violence is actually something that emerges in relationship between two people, whether it's a form of domination, a mismeeting, a misunderstanding. And I will put in a plug that if you are interested in Martin Buber's Ein Dao, on our YouTube channel, I taught a 6-week course on it. And so it's 6 hours with me talking about Martin Buber. Just if you have nothing to do. Okay, I'm going to make some assertions and send you to your breakout rooms. It's important to have these assertions because we all have opinions on sacred violence. So sacred violence can be found in seemingly every religious tradition. not only its holy wars, but in its sacred rites. Violence protects the sacred. So what does that mean? Violence protects the sacred. So if someone is going to try to harm my child, I would react in such a way that would be violent as a way of protecting what's dear and sacred to me. And I think most people have that sort of feeling or experience when they think about violence. It's an act of defense, protection. I will only do it if that which is sacred to me is in danger. But how far do those borders go? Will I act violently to protect my neighbor, a stranger, someone in traffic, right? So I say that because Baltimore is a notoriously difficult place to drive. And that violence also protects a certain form of hierarchy, that we need violence as a way of preserving peace in some strange way, and that peace is sacred. So very often, and I will refer to Baltimore, we talk about policing, that while policing in its practice has led to some unexplainable violence against the people with whom they're trying to protect, it's a necessary evil to protect a greater good. And that greater good is sacred. Violence is a universal problem and manifests in many different ways. So there isn't one form of violence. There are gradations of violence and many different interpretations of what that is. Thinking about the link between acts of destruction and religious thought has been pondered by a diversity of scholars, ranging from anthropologists to literary theorists. We all think about violence, and many times all of us are right and correct, even when we have conflicting views of what it is, because it plays such an important role in our everyday life. And before I send you to your breakout rooms, here's a very important assertion. In an interreligious setting, we need to resist the impulse to argue that my religious tradition is less violent than yours. We need to enter these conversations recognizing that the violence manifests in many of our religious traditions and either is used to justify or inspires violence done in our religious names. So with that in mind, we will go to our first breakout room and you will answer two questions. What is so sacred to you that you would defend it with violence? Can you think of a scenario in which violence would be the answer? And second, do you think violence is necessary to support or justify a greater good, whatever that greater good is? And that greater good could be peace, but is violence necessary? So we'll go into our breakout rooms. We'll talk for about 10 minutes, and then we'll come back and talk a little bit about the Crusades. We're back. Okay, welcome back. So you've talked a little bit about sacred violence. So how might we define it? Well, it's important for us to know that people often justify violence in the service of a greater good. We see it in strong ways, we see it in softer ways, but there is something implicit in the way that people justify violence in the service of a greater good. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in the second half of tonight. But what happens when we value ideas or culture more than people? And similar to the question that Matt raised last week with land, how valuable are people in our experiences? Can we put an idea or a culture above people in the same way that people have put land above people? Not suggesting that this is something that we should do, but we do know that this is something that people do. And so what happens? And how do the conditions for violence grow? So answering this question is essential to understanding the category of sacred violence. So if we understand what happens when we value ideas and culture more than people, we start to have a better sense of the category of sacred violence. And the Crusades offer countless examples of how extreme violence leads to extreme and at times unthinkable responses to it. Not all acts of violence lead to violence against others in extreme times. So what I want to do now is I want to read two separate accounts of the Rhineland massacres in 1096. One comes from a Christian, and the other is presumably someone who's Jewish. It is written in Hebrew. It's anonymous. And so we have one account by Shlomo ben Shimshon. It's the Shlomo ben Shimshon Chronicle. We don't really know who the author is, who's going to describe some of the violence that took place in Jewish communities during the Rhineland massacres. And then we will have Albert of Aachen, a historical figure, someone who did write during the Crusades about this violence, who is Christian, as a way of trying to make sense of the three quotes that I laid out at the beginning of tonight. In the beginning, there was the word. In the beginning, there was the deed. In the beginning, there is relation. So where is violence coming from when we start to think about the violence that takes place in Europe? So here is the Hebrew Chronicle according to Shlomo ben Shimshon. They said, "Why are they occupied with doing battle against the Muslims in the vicinity of Jerusalem? Indeed, among them is a people which does not acknowledge their deity. What is more, their ancestors crucified God. Why should we let them live? Why should they dwell among us? Let our swords begin with their heads. After that, we will go on the way of our pilgrimage." So they're talking about Jews, and they're talking about the charge of deicide, and that we're starting to see the anti-Judaism and a theology take shape with some form of violence. "Behold, we travel to a distant land to do battle with the kinds of that land," so the Muslims. "We take our souls in our hands in order to kill and subjugate all those kingdoms which do not believe in the crucified. How much more so should we kill and subjugate the Jews who killed and crucified Jesus?" So there are Jews living in the land. Why do they need to go to the Middle East when there are plenty of sinners here? Let us take vengeance. Let us take vengeance upon them. Let us wipe them out as a nation. Israel's nation will be mentioned no more. Or let them be like us and acknowledge the son born of menstruation. So there is this idea that you can convert. Instead of killing them, they can be baptized and be more like them. And so this is part of the Hebrew Chronicle. "They cried out and gathered all who bore and unsheathed a sword from great to small, saying, 'Behold, the time has come to avenge him who was crucified, whom their ancestors slew. Now let not a remnant or residue escape, even an infant or suckling in the cradle.' It came to pass on the new moon of Sivan that the wicked Emicho, who was one of the more famous crusaders during the Rhineland massacres, may his bones be ground up on iron millstones," so a biblical curse, "came with a large army outside the city with crusaders and common folk. For he also said, 'It is my desire to go on the crusade.' He was our chief persecutor. He had no mercy on the elderly, on young men and young women, on infants and sucklings, nor on the ill. He made the people of the Lord like dust to be trampled. Their young men he put to the sword, and their young pregnant women he ripped open." So we're going to move to the next account. And so this is the first report of Albert of Aachen. "When the Jews saw this cruelty, approximately 200 took flight by boat in the silence of the night to Neus, The Crusaders, discovering them, inflicted upon them a similar slaughter and despoiled all their goods, leaving not even one alive. So we're starting to see things a little more specific when we look at the report of Albert as opposed to Ben Shimshon. So the second report in Mainz, Cho and the rest of his band held a council, and after sunrise, attacked the Jews in the courtyard with arrows and lances. When the bolts and doors had been forced, and the Jews had been overcome, they killed 700 of them, who in vain resisted the attack of so many thousands. They slaughtered the women, also with the point of their swords pierced young children of whatever age and sex. The Jews, seeing that their Christian enemies were attacking them and that their children were sparing no age, and children were sparing no age, fell upon one another, brothers, children, wives, mothers, and sisters, and slaughtered one another. Horrible to say, mothers cut the throats of nursing children with knives and stabbed others, preferring to perish thus by their own hands than be killed by the weapons of the uncircumcised. And so we have accounts of the mother with the 7 sons, these martyrdom accounts, in that she says that she would rather slaughter her children with a kosher knife than let the Crusaders do it. And that, in fact, she would be more venerable because she will have done what Abraham was unable to do to Isaac. And so when I say that violence begets violence, or that the response to this violence was horrific violence, it's rare that we start to see that this violence was being done inward out of the despair, that they wanted to they would kill themselves before they allowed their Christian enemies to take joy in murdering them. And that's a violence that has echoed throughout the centuries. And we have bits and pieces of that in poetry, in liturgy. It is something that echoes to today in terms of that violence. And then the third report, after the children of the Holy Covenant who were in the archbishop's chambers were killed, the Crusaders came upon them to strip the corpses and to remove them from the chambers. They threw them naked to the ground through the windows, heap upon heap, mound upon mound, until they formed a high heap. Many were still alive as they threw them. Their souls were still attached to their bodies, and they still had a bit of life. They signaled to them with their fingers, "Give us a bit of water that we might drink." When the Crusaders saw them, they asked, "Do you wish to sully yourselves? Then we shall give you water to drink, and you will be able to be saved." They shook their heads and looked to their Father in heaven, saying, "No." They pointed with their fingers to the Holy One, blessed be he, but could not utter a word from their mouths as a result of the many wounds which had been inflicted upon them. They continued to smite them mightily beyond those earlier blows until they killed them a second time. Now, part of this account has quotations from the Bible. And the idea that they were killed a second time has 2 meanings. The first, obviously, the violence continued. But there is a notion in Judaism that you will die a second death. There will be a time in which you die, and that'll be your first death. But there'll be a time in which anyone who ever knew you or remembered you or is impacted by you will also die. And when you die that second death, it will be as if you never existed, because your memory will be gone with them. And so it's playing on this idea that they not only killed the bodies a second time, but they tried to wipe out the entire culture and people, that the memory of those who were being murdered was also going to be wiped out. And so this is an important account that comes out of the Crusades that we imagine and talk about as sacred violence. But this is violence that took place for a variety of reasons. And yet many of those killed didn't always understand why they were being killed. And many times the people who were doing the killing never even knew the people that they were harming. And so this violence that comes out of the Crusades is something that we want to consider as a community tonight. And so for your breakout room, I want you to consider the following quote that you heard. When the Crusaders saw them, they asked, "Do you wish to sully yourselves?" So sully yourselves, meaning in their mind, do you wish to convert to Christianity? Do you wish to be baptized? Right? But there's a certain superciliousness and condescension to it.
Yeah.
That you are above us and therefore your punishment is deserved. That somehow, even in this circumstance, you will be so arrogant that you won't accept the truth. And this comes at a time where we start to see the beginnings of disputations too, polemics. And a lot of Christian thinkers are starting to talk about the immutable truth of history. But the reason why Christianity is true, because they're in power and that they are establishing this power. So why not just sully yourself? They could have just asked something a little bit different, as we'll find. So they shook their heads and looked onto their Father in heaven, saying, no, that they would rather die than sully themselves and become Christian. And in some ways, it sounds like the implication is they deserved it. So kindly think about the language. Crusaders are mocking Jews by asking if they would sully themselves in order to convert to Christianity. Why not simply ask, will you repent, convert, be saved? What do you think the message is here? And there is no correct answer. We are interpreting a brutal event and we're trying to make sense of it. And there are times where it doesn't make sense. But why not simply ask those questions? If the Jews in this account had answered yes, do you think their fate would have been different? And how might this be an example of sacred violence? So you have 15 minutes now in your breakout room. Actually, no, you only have 10. I'm sorry. You have 10 minutes in your breakout rooms. And we're going to come back after you've discussed this and start considering contemporary examples. I think we're back. Good. So for the next few minutes, I wanted to spend more time on it, but I think I'm going to quickly go through a contemporary idea of sacred violence. And so what you see on the screen right now is Voltaire's Candide. And those of you who have studied the Enlightenment know that the Candide is a famous book that mocks war, that mocks religion, but most importantly, it mocks the philosophical idea that comes out of Gotthold Leibniz's monads, which I know that isn't like on everybody's shelf. But the one interesting thing about Leibniz is he coins the term theodicy. And I think that a lot of us use that term today, not thinking about its early modern roots. Theodicy meaning a vindication of God. So when we ask, why do bad things happen to good people, or why does evil persist in the world? People often, in theological senses, refer to theodicy, trying to make sense of how an absolute, good, omnibenevolent, omniscient, omnipotent God could allow space for evil to flourish in the world. So what Leibniz did is that he created a philosophy in that there has to be some form of evil in order for good to persist, that there has to be a balance, and that if we look at the world as it is, this is the best of all possible worlds. And that is actually a quote. Candide, as a novel, is a commentary on that quote, and it's meant to make fun of Leibniz. So Pangloss's law comes from Dr. Pangloss, from Candide, and some of you know the word in English, Panglossian, sort of a sanguine or overly optimistic view of the world. Dr. Pangloss in this novel is Leibniz, and he has a terrible fate. And his student Candide travels the world, slowly realizing that this might not be the best of all possible worlds. However, sacred violence takes place in this new reified form of theology because it's trying to make sense in a secular context. So what we find is that divine examination, evaluation, calculation, and choice operate within a complex economy in which good and bad can be transferred and exchanged. What that means is, if there's bad in the world, we need to do more good in the world to outweigh the bad. That there's constantly a shift in balance, and that, of course, there's bad in the world, but we need to do good to make the world better. And Leibniz wrote, actually, let's not belabor Leibniz's point. But in this description of the economy of divine government is already reminiscent of the logic of contemporary wars, as we're going to find, with its own scale of risk and proportionality used to evaluate the desired and undesired consequences of military acts. So it should not be surprising to find in it an early reflection on the concept of collateral damage, right? So if there is evil in the world and there's good, but if you do a little bit of evil in order to expand that good, collateral damage is okay. It starts to see good, it starts to quantify good and bad rather than see it in pure ethics. So we get the concept of collateral damage. So what is collateral damage? In this imminent order of human and divine life, the destructive results of floods, for example, are nothing more than the collateral effect of necessary rain. We need water to live, we need water to survive. God gives us rain. Sometimes it floods, and sometimes people drown in those floods. But you can't take away the rain for the sake of those who suffer in the floods. They're inexorably linked to one another. It's a balance of good and bad. So, and I will skip the Agamben quote. It is through the collateral, blood or flood, that a government, divine or human, can demonstrate, indeed exercise its power. Right? So we have power to limit the amount of bloodshed or of flood. And sometimes we can violate our own rules to do that. So in its secularized form, political rather than metaphysical, a similar structure of argument sets up the sphere of morality as a set of calculations aimed to approximate the optimum proportion between common and necessary evils. There's evil in the world. We accept that. And so we need an overabundance of good. And sometimes in order to achieve a greater good, we need to get into the dirt and do things that in themselves are evil to eradicate it. So a necessary evil. So when we engage with the problem of violence in moderation and minimization, mostly with state violence, it is managed according to a similar economy of calculations and justified as the least possible means. Sometimes you have to go to war. Sometimes you have to bomb a house. Sometimes people are murdered who are innocent. And then it becomes debatable what makes a person innocent or guilty. But then it also becomes a form of liberation, that their death is justifying the liberation of their culture. We are making their lives better. And remember the biblical explanation that I offered at the beginning, that technological advancement doesn't always lead to moral advancement. The deeper question here is whether the modern notion of moderation of violence is part of the very logic of sacred violence that we see in the Crusades. Sometimes we need to act violently. Sometimes it's not our choice. Sometimes we preemptively act violently and say that it is not our choice. But even humanitarianism, human rights, and international humanitarian law, when abused by state or suprastate like the UN, military action has become the crucial means by which the economy of violence is calculated and managed. We start talking about people in terms of numbers, in terms of cities, buildings, communities, that no longer the violence that we imagined in the descriptions of the Crusades, but it becomes a sanitized violence in which people become reduced to numbers. And those numbers then can be calculated as part of a greater good or a lesser evil. Would you kill 15 innocent people to save 100,000? That becomes part of the moral calculus of Pangloss's law. And the principle of lesser evil is often presented as a dilemma between two or more bad choices in situations where available options seem to be limited. So for the sake of time, I'm going to skip over the Augustine. You will get the PowerPoint, so you get to see how interesting this stuff is. But the important part about Augustine that I want to focus on right now is the fourth point, that evil, unlike good, is not perfect and absolute. So good is absolute, evil is always in the process of becoming. You can't have something that's absolute evil and absolute good because it challenges God's absolute power. But so it's forever measured and calibrated on a differential scale, more or less greater or lesser, right? So some things are less evil, some things are more evil. So choosing violence as a form of liberation. I chose Game of Thrones for those of you who have seen the show. And Cersei Lannister has the famous quote, "I choose violence." The argument this evening, or the assertion this evening, is often we choose violence. And Augustine taught that it is not permissible to practice lesser evils, because to do so violates the Pauline principle, do no evil that good may come. You cannot do evil. But, and here lies its appeal, lesser evils might be tolerated when they are deemed necessary and unavoidable, or when perpetuating an evil results in the reduction of the overall amount of evil in the world. This is when violence is necessary. So think about how abstract that is. What makes a place or a person so evil that their evil requires us to act violently to reduce their evil in the world? How do we measure that? By what standard? And the standard, and again, becomes a form of sacred violence. The standard is ours, what we perceive to be good, and what we perceive to be right, and what we perceive to be civilized. And so it's the dogma of sometimes breaching dogma, right? So an exception. We have all sorts of exceptions when it comes to violence. So the economy of the lesser evil is always cited as a justification for breaching rigid rules and a entrenched dogma. Indeed, it is often used by those in power as the primary justification for the very notion of exception, i.e. the less civilized. Remember, if violence is a way of preserving hierarchy, then it's essential when we talk about rules and dogma that we need to act violently to protect, ironically, the peace. And the human rights attorney and Canadian parliamentary member and Harvard professor, Michael Ignatieff, wrote that if governments need to violate rights in a terrorist emergency, then this should be done only as an exception and according to a process of adversarial scrutiny. Exceptions do not destroy the rule, but save it, provided that they are temporary, publicly justified, and deployed as a last resort. Right? So we can do the most unthinkable things to preserve our society, to preserve what we believe is good. That even if we have a society in which every person has rights, we can violate those rights if we believe that the emergency is threatening enough. that the values that undergird a society can be held in abeyance if we feel that those that are violating them deserve a sense of violence as a last resort or exception. And the interesting argument here is that we very often resort to the last resort. And so the question that ethicists have been arguing and thinking about for decades then, would Hiroshima and Nagasaki be tolerated under the defense of the lesser evil? Right? When do people become more important than ideas? And was the dropping of 2 nuclear weapons a way of eradicating evil to increase the greater good in the world? Could we actually do that sort of calculus and be moral? And that's the question. So how do our religious traditions grapple with the realities of sacred violence? So Matt, Halla, and I are going to take the next 10 to 15 minutes to share with you not how our religious traditions are nonviolent, because we can focus on those things, but how we deal with sacred violence. How do we deal with the lesser evil? How do we deal with necessary violence? And so I will start and with the Jewish view that comes from the Talmud, and it's called the rodef, the pursuer. And so the passage goes like this: and these are the ones who are saved from transgressing, even at the cost of their own lives. So there's a euphemism there. We save them by killing them. We prevent them from sinning. So these are the times in which we can preemptively kill someone so that they don't commit a crime. One who pursues another to kill him, or pursues a male to sodomize him, or pursues a betrothed young woman to rape her. So these are the 3 instances in which you can kill someone in order to save that person. And so the rabbis, they will argue ad nauseum as to what those conditions are. Because if you do kill that person preemptively, you're guilty of murder. So how can you prove that the rodef was trying to kill someone? How can you prove that someone was going to be raped? How do you preemptively kill someone before they've actually committed the capital crime? And so what the rabbis ultimately argue is that it's impossible. And so they don't actually encourage the killing of a rodef because they can't imagine the conditions in which it would be clear to everyone that the rodef had those intentions. However, in 1995, Yigal Amir justified his murder of Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin on the basis that a public figure could be considered a rodef. That Yitzhak Rabin was leading the people Israel and Jews to the path of destruction, and he was going to murder all Jews by his policies, and therefore we could preemptively kill him. British historian Jeffrey Adelman argued that Palestinians in Gaza who voted for Hamas were rodefim. They were also rodef, and thus could be preemptively killed. So we have an ancient text that talks about sacred violence and necessary evil. We have in that very same text 1,000 years of rabbis saying they can't imagine a condition in which you could actually do this. And then in the last 30 years, we have 2 people that famously argued that you should, and in fact, in one case did. So we will move to Halla and share with us the Muslim view.
All right.
Or a Muslim view.
So I decided to talk about jihad because, as we all know, it is a Muslim concept that is often associated with the idea of sacred violence in Islam. So I thought I would take these 5 minutes to kind of unpack it and look at it from as many sides as we can. So the term jihad is a complex theological concept that has acquired a range of meanings throughout Muslim history and thought. And its meanings, I would like to suggest, is also very complex within the Western American context, especially during the Cold War in the 80s. So I'll start within Islam. So the word jihad does appear in Muslim texts. It appears in the Quran, and it appears in the Muslim traditions, which are called the hadiths that are attributed to the Prophet Muhammad and his companions. So in the Quran, jihad is often translated or understood as a struggle or the act of exerting oneself for the purpose of monotheism and belief. Often it is used in Quranic verses referencing the story of the migration of the Prophet Muhammad and his followers from Mecca to Medina. Excuse me. So Muslims believe that soon after the Prophet Muhammad started inviting the Meccan tribes to monotheism, they were persecuted and it was a struggle. So in this sense, jihad means a sense of a struggle or needless suffering. There are a couple of verses whereby jihad does indicate this notion of sacred violence, whereby it is associated with the idea of fighting. So one question I should say that many Muslim thinkers bring to the Quran is whether these texts are meant to be descriptive, right? Telling the story of what was going on in the context of the Quran or the Islamic sacred history, or prescriptive, whether this idea of jihad is intended to be universal. And as we will see, this concept of jihad is interpreted in very, very many different ways in Muslim practice. And really quickly, jihad does also appear in the hadith traditions. And you also get a very complex picture of what jihad means. So there is a hadith, for example, attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, who says that the best path for jihad is speaking words of justice against an oppressive tyrant. But there are also other parallel hadiths that say the best jihad is fighting an oppressive tyrant. So there are multiple hadiths that kind of give you a different impression of what jihad means. There are also hadiths that talk about jihad in kind of more moralistic terms, whereby the best jihad is taking care of one's parents. I'd also heard at some point that even women giving birth, that's considered a form of jihad. So in the Muslim traditions, you get a variety of meanings, and how it's understood later changes. So in Muslim practices, there's a variety of ways in which jihad has been understood. In the past century or so, particularly in the post-colonial period, you begin to see the idea of jihad being used to signify this idea of a holy war against the religious other. So this is the brand of jihad adopted by bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, and so forth, who view the world in these rigid binary terms. So there's sort of this maximalist understanding of the other, right? The other, the infidels, are not just non-Muslims, Christians, it's also other Muslims. And you have, like, as Ben was saying, this value of an idea over people. But you also have the idea of jihad being used in by progressive Muslims striving for equality. So you have, for example, Amna Wadud, who is a Muslim American scholar. She uses this term in her book, pictured here above, Inside the Gender Jihad, to kind of describe her feminist activism. And you see a picture of her here on the lower right, leading a group in prayer, which is traditionally done by men. So this she sees as a form of jihad or a struggle. I hope I'm not going over my 5 minutes, but I just have one more thing to add, just to kind of show that jihad is also very complex within American thought. So often the term jihad, if we're hearing it on the news, is almost always about terrorism or the idea of a Muslim holy war. So it takes on this very singular bad or negative meaning. However, this is not always the case. One example is the use of the term mujahideen, which I should have written up there. So this word mujahideen comes from the same root as jihad, and it basically means someone, men more specifically, who participate in jihad. But to the CIA and to American foreign policy in the 80s, mujahideen acquired this meaning of freedom fighters. So here it kind of develops this positive meaning. It is the lesser evil that Ben was talking about. The mujahideen, in the context of Afghanistan, are Afghan fighters fighting communist Russia. And I don't know if you've seen Charlie Wilson's War. It just occurred to me that here's another Tom Hanks movie that's associated with the idea of the Crusades. But here on the lower left is the picture of the actual Congressman Charlie Wilson pictured with the Mujahideen. As many of you know, he was a representative. In the 80s, he was on the Foreign Affairs Committee and was part of the Operation Cyclone, I think it was called, with the CIA. They provided a lot of funds and money to the Mujahideen, who were the good fighters against communist Russia. And that's it.
So anyone who's been following me for the last year will not be surprised that I'm going to talk about the Capitol riot. I just put together a podcast series actually on the kind of charismatic Christians and the Capitol riot. So this is drawing on a little bit of that research as well. I just dropped the link if you're interested in the series as a whole. But basically the premise of my current research is that as you have the lead up to the Capitol riot, the January 6th insurrection, you had hundreds of thousands of charismatic Christians. And by charismatic, this is kind of a style of Christianity, very focused on the Holy Spirit, very focused on supernatural occurrences. It's kind of adjacent to Pentecostalism, but not quite the same thing as Pentecostalism. And these charismatic Christians believed that demons were manipulating the election results in order to steal the 2020 election from Donald Trump. And so they believe that through their own spiritual warfare and through the political mobilization of the people in their ranks, they could thwart those demonic aggressions, and they could return America to its covenant destiny with God. So kind of a notion of kind of Christian nationalism, that America has a special destiny, a special covenant with God, and enact God's will for Trump to have a second presidential term. And you might have seen articles about kind of all the different prophets, charismatic prophets who had prophesied that Trump would have a second term. And it's very much tied in with all this idea that God was speaking. God had a will for the 2020 election, and that will was being thwarted as Joe Biden was declared the winner. And so this spiritual warfare mobilization amongst charismatic Christians was one of the central contributing factors to what became the Capitol riot. You just had hundreds of thousands of people kind of doing spiritual warfare, using rhetoric of spiritual warfare. And so the character here, we're going to see a little video of him. His name is Dutch Sheets, and he's one of the real leaders of this mobilization. And Sheets was what we revealed in the podcast series. He was actually taking meetings at the White House in the lead up to January 6th. So there was definitely a sense within the White House of tracking this mobilization of spiritual warfare and even utilizing it for the sake of Donald Trump's Stop the Steal campaign. And Sheets is important because he was the one who coined the usage of these appeal to heaven flags, these colonial American flags. You can see in the picture there that it's a green pine tree on a white background with the phrase "the appeal to heaven." And Sheets used this as a symbol of this spiritual warfare campaign to restore American greatness, to restore American covenantal purity. And then he attached that to Donald Trump. And if you go and look at the footage of the Capitol riot, you see dozens, maybe even hundreds of these flags, these appeal to heaven flags in the crowd, all of them pointing back to Dutch Sheets and his kind of ideas. But what I want to focus on is not so much the Capitol riot tonight as an event that occurred about a month before the Capitol riot on December 12th. December 12th, you had what was called a Jericho March in Washington, D.C. A bunch of these charismatic leaders, other Christian leaders, Michael Flynn, Mike Lindell, people that you probably heard of, Oath Keepers and Proud Boys, showed up in Washington, D.C. and held this Jericho March. And that evening, so the Jericho March was on the National Mall during the day on December 12th. That evening, the Proud Boys, who are on trial right now for their violence on January 6th, they went and caused rioting in D.C. And they even went and attacked an African-American Methodist church and tore down a Black Lives Matter banner there at the church. So you have this kind of premonition of January 6th happening on December 12th. And we're going to watch. The Sheets had a daily podcast where he would lead people in how to pray, how to mobilize for spiritual warfare. And I want you to listen to what he had to say, the prayer that he prays on December 12th, on the same day that this kind of mini Capitol riot breaks out in DC.
For today. Lord, you have led us to this place in time, this hinge of history. You knew how intense this war would be, that the enemy would fight hard to move this nation away from covenant with you. You know how high the stakes are. Therefore, you have raised up a mighty praying army for such a time as this. Your Holy Spirit is leading us and helping us pray strong and accurate prayers. We are using the keys of the kingdom as you have been training us to do for the past few years. An evil plan has been woven in our nation. It has been worked on for decades, and those weaving it believe they will prevail. But we hear you say, watch as the unraveling begins. We thank you, Lord. The tide is turning. We believe your word and what you say. You are encouraging us. You are refreshing us even as we continue. Together with you, we will overcome overwhelming odds and the agendas of demons. We will see victory. We proclaim liberty, freedom over America in our generation. Let hope and confident faith arise, Lord. And as we activate and intercede in that faith, we will remain refreshed and renewed. Help us to keep our eyes on the prize of the multitudes of souls waiting to be introduced to you. Help us maintain the freedom to spread the gospel to the ends of the earth. Enable us to once again be that light you created us to be. A light in the darkness, a city on a hill, lighting the way to Jesus. We declare, Lord, everything standing in the way of our nation's destiny and the advancement of Christ's kingdom in America, dissipate, get out of the way in Jesus' name. Amen.
So as we move towards our last breakout time, I guess the last just question I would raise has been highlighted this horrific violence that takes place at the end of the 11th century in the Crusades against these Jewish communities. And I think sometimes we Christians want to think that Christian violence is this bygone era, this thing that happened in the past that we are detached from. And yet I would argue that this rhetoric of violence, this rhetoric of Christian nationalism contributed directly to one of the great crises of our time, the Capitol riot. And this is an ongoing thing where you have charismatic Christians and other Christians using this language of warfare, language of violent warfare in talking about American politics. It's becoming ingrained within our politics. And so this Christian violence is not a thing of the past. It's very much a thing of the present.
So we're going to give you 7 minutes, and I apologize that we took some of your breakout room time to just ponder as a group whether or not in defending culture or religion, can interreligious dialogue help us think beyond the choice of the lesser evil? Or is sacred violence always the answer? And so in our groups, we want to just ponder that. And we will leave our answers open-ended because obviously this is a conversation that will extend beyond our meeting tonight. So we're going to wrap up. We have a few minutes. So each of us will get our few moments before we close for the evening. I hope you were able to grapple with these issues in your breakout rooms. I tried to be as provocative as I could within certain limits, but know that these are questions that all of us are dealing with. The one thing that I want to share with you before we depart, at least from my own point of view, is the one thing that I neglected to tell you at the beginning that I think is actually quite interesting is that davar, thing and word, as we were grappling with that, in the Hebrew Bible, what we call the 10 Commandments are the Eser Divrot, the 10 davars. We have a word in Hebrew for commandment. It's mitzvah or chok or law. But in this case, the word and thing are the things that make up the 10 sayings, the 10 Commandments. Just something to consider in terms of our afterlife of words and ideas. So I want to let my colleagues here send us off into the evening with either something inspiring or something concerning.
I guess I'll go ahead.
Sure.
I've really been thinking about the question whether inner faith dialogue can help us kind of think beyond this sacred violence. And I'd like to think yes, I am optimistic there, but I found myself thinking that it either starts with or should be kind of in tandem with this sort of deep self-reflection on what is hidden violence to myself, right? And vis-a-vis what I do consider sacred. I was thinking of your first question, Ben, if somebody were to hurt my kid. When my son was 1 year old, one of the first times I took him to the playground, this 3-year-old kid came and he whacked him to the floor. Everything was fine. I calmed him down, but deep down, this kid made me so angry. So just, realizing when something is that sacred to you, I think it's not only would you act violently, but how, and I don't know. So there's just a lot of self-reflection and not taking for granted, maybe. Yeah. Reflective thought.
I'm gonna offer a little bit of an ode to cultural despair as we wrap up this session. We are living in an era where violence and the rhetoric of violence is becoming increasingly normalized in our culture. And I think it's easy to feel like this is especially happening in right-wing politics today. I was just telling Ben, and I'll drop the link in the chat here, but just today on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives, they were talking about the murder of Tyree Nichols in Memphis, and Marjorie Taylor Greene interjects and says, well, yes, he died, and that's terrible, but somebody else died just outside of our chamber here, Ashley Babbitt, during the Capitol riot. No one has ever faced prosecution for her murder. And there are these poor, innocent Capitol rioters who are suffering in DC jails today because of unjust prosecution, right? And this style of whataboutism, the style of reciprocal, like, oh, well, there's violence over here, and it's all just right, and kind of minimizing this is really taking hold in a powerful way. And I think those of us who are committed to interreligious dialogue, those of us who are committed to nonviolence or some principled nonviolence, I think we really need to be reflective about the ways so that we don't do the reciprocal and say, oh, well, they're using a rhetoric of violence, we can also use a rhetoric of violence. And you even see this around the Capitol riot, where people start saying, these people attacked the sacred chambers of our democracy. They attacked the temple of democracy, right? Sacralizing these secular buildings And then as a way of kind of saying what they did was even worse than just going after government buildings. So I just think we really have to be careful about how we think about this. And I think that interreligious dialogue can help us to recognize that what we hold sacred, other people hold other things sacred. And maybe that will help to short circuit some of the craziness.
Thank you, everyone. We want to be cognizant and respectful of your time. We look forward to seeing you next week, where we wrap up with the idea of civilization and how sacred land and sacred violence play out in our understandings of what we consider to be the civilized world. Wishing you a wonderful week, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.